13 years. PlanetSide 1 might not be like some other failures we have covered in the series with a lengthy history and a legendary pioneer status, but I think that there is still very much to diagnose and uncover in the timeline of PS1 that could have led to the game having even greater success, something some would say closer to PS2 even. And that's sort of what we do in the Death of a Game series, a series where we take the largest contributing factors for a game's death or demise by utilizing various clues and bits of evidence that we uncover navigating the timeline of events, and then put it all together for a final deduction, in the end, where every detective's favorite moment of truth happens, and we solve the case. We're gonna have to dig back deep for this one, which excites me, I must say. 24 years in the past is going to be chock full of history and intrigue, so let's get to the case. With the incredible success of the first 3D online persistent RPG, EverQuest, or that is what IGN and perhaps some others at the time were calling the genre in the 2000s, SOE would express the desire to create yet more virtual worlds. As described by lead designer Kevin McCann, PS1 was a world where players, when they first create a character in the game, will ally that character with one of the 4 rival corporations that are at war with another, so even if you're playing by yourself, you're still part of the parent team, part of a cause. So people who are in the field with you might help you out because you are part of the same corporation as you. You can further form outfits that are basically your supported clans. Under these corporations, they work much more as a team. The goal of the game really is pretty much territorial war. Now the actual background story, with each side, of course, has their own propaganda, but the game definitely takes much more of a focus on the actual action. It's funny how in hindsight the idea of combined arms territorial control warfare online worlds, well that's a mouthful, seemed quite simple in explanation, but it was anything but that. PlanetSide 1 was pushing the boundaries like many pioneers in the early virtual world scene. What was for the time largely a focus on online play period, these titles were searching for yet more. They wanted what was described as massive gameplay, and thus a massive world. PlanetSide was early on trying to have merely hundreds of players. Later on, they were able to hit as many as 999 players, breaking a Guinness World Record in the process, and helping define what would be later known as the MMO genre. If you notice that I didn't say RPG, it's because PS1 was an FPS, which also made it a unique pioneer in the space. Don Newfield, who also served as the lead programmer on the project, would detail in a Medium post how close the game was to be cancelled, which makes it a miracle it even launched, let alone broke the records and expectations. According to Don, the lead programmers working on the project before were less than stellar, or preoccupied at least, which shifted him, despite his inexperience at the time, into a leadership position. And I think it's just really interesting to hear how close to the finish line some of these projects can get, like PS1, and still manage to have such serious issues that threaten the project's life. But this was all too common for pioneers in the MMO space. They were basically treading untreaded ground. PlanetSide 1, July 2nd, 2001 would preview their game for all to see. PS1 was already capable of achieving 500 players, which was incredibly impressive. Check out these early screenshots of what the game looked like and showcased what the early NC faction looked like, which we will talk about more shortly. PlanetSide 1's beta would take place November 1st, 2002 and would feature up to 1,000 players at the same time. You have to remember, this is pre-WoW popularizing the genre, so how impressive this was in 2002 cannot be understated. By beta, PlanetSide was described as set far into the future and a war-based RPG of epic proportions. With nearly 64 kilometers of land per continent, a brand new 3D engine, and lifelike visual effects and ambient sounds, PlanetSide is one of SOE's heavy hitters. I don't know if they were going by RPG, by the way, or that's just IGN calling them an RPG. The plot, though, such as it is, involves future spacefaring humans under the banner of the totalitarian Terran Republic, stumbling through a wormhole onto a suspiciously Earth-like planet dubbed Araxis, and becoming trapped there when the wormhole unexpectedly closes off. Cut off from the rest of humanity, the Araxians splintered into 3 factions, kicking off an all-out war for control over the bases established across the planet. The featured factions that still exist today in PlanetSide 2 were the New Conglomerate, the NC, the Vanu Sovereignty, or the VS, and the TR, or Terran Republic. Terran Republic remained loyal to the Empire, and their ultimate goal was to re-establish the wormhole and bring the planet back under Terran control proper. Their weapons and vehicles would spew bullets and shells at high rates of fire but have relatively low damage per shot. The New Conglomerate, or NC, are a coalition of rebels who prefer democracy, freedom, and human rights over the Republic's totalitarian regime or the sovereignty's secretive technocracy. Their weapons are slow firing, but pack a high damage per shot, and their vehicles are big and slow but heavily armored. The Vanu Sovereignty, or the VS, are a cult of scientists and other intellectuals who embraced the Vanu technology that they discovered to a much greater extent than the other factions, hoping to eventually ascend to a higher plane of existence, as they believed that the Vanu originally did themselves. Energy weapons are their specialty, of course, and often with the unique ability to fire in standard or armor-piercing modes using the same sort of ammo. Their vehicles are relatively fragile, but that allows them to strafe quickly and scoot over bodies of water and attack from unexpected angles. Now I want you guys to go to war in the comments and tell me which faction, in your opinion, is the best and why. And I should say I personally enjoy the Vanu's slick machinery and Power Ranger color scheme, but that's just me. The factions would become iconic in PlanetSide, despite not having super deep lores. It was cool to see how invested the Rogue Planet Games team was behind this from the start, and this should serve as a lesson to other virtual world creators that success in factions in a world immersion doesn't come without intention and work, and being early in the process. PlanetSide 1 would launch May 20th, 2003, and although many players were enjoying the game, and according to aggregate review website Metacritic, 81% of the critics were also enjoying it. IGN, on the other hand, are now notorious for not knowing much about virtual worlds, and even continuing to do that much later in their years, would rate PS1 a 7.7 out of 10, stating that what can be a really exciting team game experience is marred by having to play with uncooperative idiots, monotonous landscapes, long wait times to get into the action, and a serious lack of definitive purpose. Not having a greater goal to strive towards means hollow victories and eventual lack of interest. Now the first bit. Let's just be honest here. Join a clan or find people to play with. It's not really a striking criticism, but it's a real one at least. I mean, team games do rub some players the wrong way. It's just kind of a moot point. The second point about how much long-term goals of progression were lacking, though, is kind of real and spot on, honestly, about the series in general. PlanetSide doesn't flex its muscles generally with the stuff that most MMOs are known for. And while that lends itself to the FPS nature of the game, many virtual world fans like myself are left a bit wanting. They would further explain in the review itself that although the factions being varied from each other and having backstories was cool, they didn't really seem to be actually deep enough or different past the surface level. There wasn't an ongoing story, and the actual plot of the game has hardly ever evolved. Players enjoy virtual worlds for how they feel when they live in them, and PS1's world was a bit monotonous and repetitive, even for the time, and it struggled to catch long-term attention in many ways because of that. Still, some reviewers, like IGN and even players, because PS1 was fashioned more like a shooter, they were expecting like Battlefield or Wolfenstein levels of competition, and that just wasn't really feasible given the engine of PlanetSide 1 at the time, and just not really their competition at the end of the day. Where PS1 would soar, and where PS2 IMO kind of like fails at, is there was far more of a focus on the logistics of the battle and the transport of materials to the process of what was called ants. I think logistics are super underdeveloped in video games, think like games like Foxhole, especially when they're done in a way that's both useful and fun, which is kind of difficult to do. PS1 had more of a focus on gathering the resources that you would need to spawn vehicles and special troops, while PS2 in the future would remove most of this. I think there's two ideas here, or two schools of thoughts, and that's where the divide of PS1 is quite evident even from inception. One is that PS2 took more of the FPS approach, which was warranted to evolve the series for FPS fans. Two is that the MMO roots of PS1 were largely removed by the time the game launched, and especially PS2 would launch. That's because supposedly PS1 was supposed to originally contain AI, a persistent threat that players would actually have to work against. And the game would also feature an economy and quests in a much more fleshed out world. However, somewhere along the way, Rogue Planet Games would shift PS1 towards being more of an online FPS, and while there were some strengths to that, I think in the end they actually struggled heavily because of their decision, as I will explain later. PS1, though, was changing the way the world viewed online FPSs, and I mean this is 3 years before Battlefield 2142 for reference, and 1 year after Battlefield 1942. PlanetSide 1, being a product of the time, would follow suit with its stablemate EverQuest and create a paid expansion. Combat Core would hit the world September 29th, 2003, and like the name implied, would update the core combat of the game. It would also add the controversial mech suits to the game, a heavily armored juggernaut special troop that had a massive health pool and power weapons. The majority of the changes with the game were fundamental balance changes, however, and there's really nothing wrong with that if it was just like a major free update. But this was a paid expansion, which is kind of bizarre in hindsight. $30 for a few new zones, which I forgot to mention because the zones are pretty much the same stuff rinse and repeat with different color schemes and no new mechanics added or story. The expansion was controversial, and according to fans it wasn't really worth the money, which ended up splitting the player base. But SOE and thus Rogue Planet Games were reportedly dedicated to creating more content to keep their persistent world alive. And while some were writing off PlanetSide as merely just an online FPS shooter, it seemed like SOE still wanted in some ways for the game to be seen as an MMO, or at least a virtual world. PlanetSide Aftershock was the bundled deal that included both the combat core and the newest update, Battle Frame Robotics, or BFRs for short, and thus the fate of the game was even more irreversibly changed than with mech suits. BFRs were created in part to solve the already ever-increasing issue of a low population, which would only continue to worsen with the mega launch of WoW in 2004. BFRs and artillery were effectively ways for smaller groups of players to compete against larger groups of players, which always sounds like a good idea in theory. The problem arises when the more dominant forces tries to and starts to and succeeds at acquiring them more than the others, and thus keep the other players from doing the same. It's especially worse when things like BFRs would just eat tanks for breakfast. Throw in a desperate need for balancing at launch, and the BFR update is easily one of the most disliked, which again is saying something with mech suits in the conversation. Now, the issue I found with BFRs wasn't necessarily them being included, period, and I know some people feel that way, especially because they weren't included in the second game. But the problem I think is that after they were included and just 1 year later, they weren't updated anymore, despite community complaints. This in a modern context is a bit more obvious, as it's oftentimes seen as a developer not properly responding to their community feedback and thus paying the price, but this was more common back then, especially with pioneer MMOs. The focus was shifted more towards content at the time and shiny things, which is kind of like an idea that makes sense, right? But unfortunately, that wasn't what was bleeding the already existing player base. And paid expansions do very little to attract new players, unfortunately. The bending was a major moment in PS1 history. It was the last major update on the level of an expansion, and it helped define more of the story of the world and the game. Now, what the bending actually added in terms of content is kind of murky, but it was heavily narrative focused and essentially took multiple continents of the planet Araxis and kind of turned them into their own planets. I'm not really sure what it's supposed to signify, except maybe just giving them more backstory, because now they were ignored largely as biomes by players, and so now that they're planets, maybe players wouldn't ignore them as much, and that now that they have more backstory. But by this point on the timeline of virtual worlds, WoW and many other successful virtual worlds had been out for years, and although PlanetSide 1 wowed everyone when it came out, it looked dated and within just a few years was getting wowed itself. Which is not as much their fault as a fault of the time and tech, which happened to many other developers across genres as well, but especially in the MMO genre. It's just that when you're an action-focused territorial game, your gameplay is mostly what people are going to be interested in and thus judge your game. There's a higher bar there to meet. And not to mention, virtual worlds arguably have some of the worst gameplay when compared to other games, especially single-player titles. So when you think about PS1, it's in this interesting in-between, where graphically and gameplay-wise, it was impressive when it came out, but it aged a decade in just a few years after, which would certainly help it fall out of favor. And worse, make people judge it very harshly because the gameplay just wasn't up to snuff. Multiple years later, PlanetSide 1 would put out their final update, now a clear shell of their past glory. So much would happen in the world of virtual worlds in just the short 5-year span. The last update was just a Vista and Windows 7 update primarily, and nothing more significant. For some, it might confuse why there was so little happening, but remember, SOE had like a dozen games that they were juggling, and PS1 probably just fell to the wayside. SOE would survive for a few more years after becoming another company altogether, Daybreak Game Company. But that wasn't it for Rogue Planet Games and the PlanetSide franchise. It turns out, most likely starting somewhere in 2009 or 2010, they had